In Magic, a card that affects the outcome of a combat step is commonly referred to as a combat trick. Generally speaking, combat tricks are not hard removal, and instead help shift the outcome of combat, most frequently by buffing your own creatures to come out on top in the exchange. While most combat tricks tend to see play in limited given their lower power level compared to hard removal, some combat tricks have managed to be impactful and important cards in competitive formats, which is what we'll be looking at today. And at number 10, we have Tainted Strike. This is an instant from Scars of Mirrodin that costs a single black mana to give target creature +1 power and the Infect keyword until the end of the turn. Infect is a keyword that means whenever the creature deals damage to a creature, it does so in the form of -1/-1 counters instead of conventional damage. This means damage from creatures with Infect is effectively permanent as the creature's stats are shrunk down for each -1 counter on it. However, the real impact of Infect comes from the other half of its effect. When a creature with Infect deals damage directly to a player, instead of dealing damage, it instead gives the player poison counters. When a player has 10 or more poison counters, they instantly lose the game. This means a creature with 10 power that isn't blocked essentially will one-shot a player. And while creatures with high power aren't exactly common, there have been decks that made use of this card. Notably, Death Shadows decks use this card in early iterations of the strategy, leveraging its namesake creature's high attack power to sneak one-shots with Tainted Strike, along with other combat tricks. With time, those decks moved away from Tainted Strike, and in general, the card didn't see a vast amount of play. Generally speaking, Infect strategies prefer the creatures to have Infect already, instead of having to rely on a spell to give the creature the ability. Tainted Strike, however, does have some use specifically in Pauper thanks to being a common. Often find itself as one of the game-ending spells in Kiln Fiend decks. Kiln Fiend gains 3 power every time you cast an instant and sorcery, meaning only a few low-cost spells is enough to put Kill Fiend into lethal range with Tainted Strike. The spell also has some use in the Commander format, given that in a format where the starting life total is 40, the number of poison counters needed to make your opponent lose is still just 10. Tainted Strike has far less success than the other cards ahead of it on this list, but is still relevant enough to still see play every now and then in the modern list, which is enough for it to take the 10th spot. And at number 9 is Blacksmith Skill. This instant costs a single white mana and was first printed in Modern Horizons 2. This high power set was aimed specifically at injecting new playable cards into the modern format and powering up lower powered strategies. Blacksmith Skill is a more subtle example of this than some of Modern Horizons 2 more notable playable cards. This instant gives target permanent both hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn, as well as giving the creature +2 power and toughness if it was an artifact creature. Hexproof means an opponent cannot target the creature with spells or abilities, and indestructible means the creature cannot be destroyed. These two keywords together protect a creature from just about most ways a creature might be removed, especially in competitive play. This efficient yet potent protection quickly found a home in one of the new decks born from Modern Horizons 2, Hammer Time. Built around the namesake card, Colossus Hammer, these decks aim to equip a small, elusive creature with equipments like Hammer and get in for lethal. The deck already runs mostly artifact creatures, with Esper Sentinel forcing your opponent to pay extra for spells or let you draw cards each turn. With the card Urza's Saga providing the deck with the ability to search 1 mana value artifacts, many builds of the deck are able to flex into various options of artifact creatures they run as searchable 1/ofs. As such, this deck is often putting most of its focus on single artifact creatures in combat, and this makes it fairly easy for decks to disrupt the deck by killing the equipped creature before it can actually deal any damage. Blacksmith Skill is the most efficient way to protect those creatures, with it specifically even offering the bonus boost to artifact creatures, allowing the card to be used offensively as well as defensively. The only reason Blacksmith Skill isn't higher on this list is the deck that runs it is relatively new, and not any other decks have really found a home for the card yet. And at number 8, we have Sejiri Shelter. Printed in Zendikar Rising, Sejiri Shelter is an instant that costs 1 generic and 1 white mana. It gives target creature you control protection from the color of your choice until the end of the turn. Protection means the card cannot be damaged, enchanted, blocked, or targeted by whatever it has protection from. In this case, if Sejiri Shelter gave protection from black, no black spells could target the creature, and no black creature would be able to block it either. Protection is versatile in that it can save a creature, or if your opponent only has creatures of a single color, make a creature essentially unblockable. In theory, Sejiri Shelter is worse than a similar card like God's Willing, which costs 1 less mana for the same effect plus a bonus effect in Scrying. But Sejiri Shelter is actually a dual-face card, and may instead be played as Sejiri Glacier. While it's just a land that enters tapped and taps for white mana, the fact that it can be freely played as a land instead of a spell gives it far more versatility than any similar spells that grant protection. Aggressive decks like Boros aggro decks and Pioneer that most frequently use this card tend to want as little land as possible. These decks run low value mana spells and generally don't need too many lands to function. In being both a playable combat trick and a land in a pitch, Sejiri Shelter lets aggressive decks cheat out their land count while maintaining the amount of protection spells these sorts of decks want. Specifically in Pioneer, these Boros aggro decks take advantage of cards like 10th District Legionnaire that have the abilities that give benefits when the creature's targeted with a spell. As such, Sejiri Shelter has become a mainstay in specific builds of aggro, as well as various other, less successful aggro decks in other formats. And at number 7, we have Blossoming Defense. This instant costs a single green mana and gives target creature +2 power and toughness and hexproof until the end of the turn. The aforementioned Blacksmith skill technically provides more and might on surface level seem like a better fit for this spell on the list. While Indestructible is good, generally speaking, Hexproof alone is enough to protect most things that would actually kill the creature. These decks only really go fully on the offensive when they're confident they'll win combat, and maybe even the entire game that turn if they can help it. As such, the ideal target for these protection spells will win combats without needing to be indestructible in the first place. This alone means a Blossoming Defense isn't too much of a downgrade. However, it's the fact that Blossoming Defense is green that really makes it so potent. While white has recently seen the rise of its own all-in combat decks, green has been playing them for much longer. In the standard format the card was printed into, it was often used to protect Electrostatic Pummeler in aggressive green-red energy decks. However, the card has expanded into various other formats, specifically finding its home in dedicated Infect decks. As you've already heard, and will continue to hear throughout this list, Infect as a mechanic is behind a lot of combat tricks and their playability. In this case, a Blossoming Defense is the most efficient and on-color way for Infect decks to protect their threats from removal. This is its use case in basically any deck that runs it, such as the blue-green builds of Pioneer Spirits that sometimes use the card. It's one of the most efficient ways to save a creature in the color most likely to want to do so. The cards ahead of it are more varied in their use cases, often proving to be as effectively relevant as defensively relevant, which is why Blossoming Defense finds itself only at 7th on this list. And at number 6, we have Invigorate. This instant spell costs 2 generic and 1 green mana, and gave target creature +4 power and toughness until the end of the turn. Compared to the original gold standard of combat tricks, Giant Growth, this costs 2 more mana for only 1 more power and toughness, which should make this card terrible. But what makes this card so good is that it has an alternative casting cost. As long as you control Forest, instead of paying any mana, you may instead have an opponent gain 3 life instead of paying Invigorate's mana cost. This makes Invigorate essentially a free spell, although the life it gives your opponent is meant to prevent it from being used to overwhelm and kill an opponent out of nowhere. The idea was that Invigorate could be used to surprise your opponent and kill a creature in combat at the cost of gaining them back some life. And while this is a useful scenario, it's not the reason this card is played. As previously mentioned, the Infect mechanic beats an opponent via counters instead of direct damage. As such, Infect decks and Legacy run Invigorate as an effective pump spell for their Infect creatures. One Invigorate targeting a Blighted Agent is half the poison counters needed to kill an opponent without the opponent even being allowed to block it. And since this Invigorate costs no mana, the Infect player is free to use other pump spells or even other copies of Invigorate to get the needed 10 poison counters. Modern Infect decks would absolutely run Invigorate as well, however the card was not printed in any modern legal sets, and thus has never been legal in that format. Given this, and the fact that this card only really sees playing Infect strategies, it's not quite able to break into the top 5, especially since the cards ahead of it see playing comparatively much wider variety of strategies. And at number 5, we have Become Immense. While most playable combat tricks have low mana values, Become Immense costs 5 generic and 1 green mana. This instant gives target creature +6 power and toughness until the end of the turn. Of course, this card also has the keyword ability Delve, which allows you to exile cards from your graveyard to help pay for its cost. For each card exiled, it counts for 1 generic mana, meaning this deck can cost as low as a single green mana if you exile 5 cards from your graveyard. This total isn't all too high in competitive formats, given the prominence of cheap interaction. Unsurprisingly, Legacy in fact exiles those Invigorates it casts for free to then cast Become Immense just to really make sure the attack is lethal. And while its use in Infect is fairly obvious given the sheer amount of spells and the desire for high power the deck has, what brings Become Immense higher than the previous cards is that it sees play in other strategies with success. Recently, the card is seen play in Crashing Footfalls decks. Those decks are quick and aggressive, yet cannot run spells with mana value 1 or 2 thanks to the deck's main gimmick of using the ability Cascade to cast its namesake spell for free. When a spell cascades, you reveal the top card of your deck until you find a spell that has a lesser mana value. By running no cards with a mana value 1 or 2, these decks can cascade with 3 drops and guarantee to hit Crashing Footfalls. As such, the deck needs to offset this by playing spells that have technically high mana values that aren't too expensive to actually cast thanks to the alternative casting conditions. Become Immense helps this deck close out the game, given that the Rhino tokens Crashing Footfalls makes have trample. This means any excess damage they deal to a creature is dealt to the player. So, if your opponent blocks a small creature, you can surprise them with Become Immense and deal a massive chunk of damage. Become Immense is the last card in this list that provides just raw power and toughness and no other abilities or bonus effects, which is why it only manages to be the 5th best on this list. And at number 4, we have the Wandering Emperor. This Planeswalker costs 2 generic mana and 2 white mana and enters with 3 loyalty counters. Generally speaking, Planeswalkers are not usually combat tricks, but the Wandering Emperor can be cast on your opponent's turn, and on that turn you may activate her loyalty abilities at instant speed. This allows this Planeswalker to function as both a Planeswalker and as a combat trick, since her +1 loyalty ability gives up to 1 target creature a +1/+1 counter, as well as First Strike until the end of turn. First Strike's name is literal, meaning the creature will hit first in combat, and, if lethal damage is assigned, not be hit back in combat. Admittedly, it's more common that she enters and uses her -1 ability to create a Samurai token with 2 power and toughness, or to exile a tapped creature and gain 2 life with her -2 loyalty ability. But sometimes that +1 is enough to win combat on its own. And instead of using the Emperor's loyalty, the combat trick mode can be used to catch an opponent off guard and make sure the Wandering Emperor has the highest loyalty possible. The card's versatility as both an offensive and defensive option has led it to seeing play in virtually every format. In particular, control decks have taken to using the Wandering Emperor given that it can represent a repeatable source of creatures and removal. Control decks, particularly ones in older formats, prefer for their win conditions to be as minimal as possible, to both make room for interaction and to help make board wipes as one-sided as possible. Modern decks often use Celestial Colonnade as a primary attacking threat since it could spend most of its time as a land. The Wandering Emperor in particular is effective at punishing aggressive decks in combat, swinging the tempo of the game by using the Emperor to both take out a creature that should have otherwise been safe. And once the control deck has run their opponent out of resources, the Emperor can both produce more creatures but also make them stronger to eventually close out the game. Even legacy control decks have adopted the card for just how potent it is at checking creature-focused decks. It could arguably be higher, but some could also argue that since its combat trick mode is the least powerful mode, and that the card is also often hard removal, it might not be deserving of being so high. In the end, its use as a combat trick is relevant enough, and the card is prolific enough that it was deserving at least the 4th spot on this list. And at number 3, we have Embercleave. This legendary equipment from Throne of Eladrin is another atypical combat trick, but also has the ability to be cast on your opponent's turn. It costs 4 generic and 2 red mana, although it costs 1 less to cast for each attacking creature you control. When it enters the battlefield, it automatically attaches itself to a creature you control for no cost, which is what allows it to function as a proper combat trick. The equipped creature gets +1 power and toughness, as well as double strike and trample. Double strike grants not only the aforementioned first strike, but then also allows the creature to deal damage during the normal damage phase as well. This boost allows a 5-powered creature to threaten a total of 12 damage over the course of 2 damage phases. And if the creature blocking it has less power, then the attacking creature will be completely safe thanks to double strike killing the creature before it got to deal the damage. Instantly, the card became a mainstay in Standard with red-green aggro decks. Towards the end of its life in Standard, it was particularly effective alongside Goldspan Dragon, alongside the aggressively costed adventure creatures. Part of the threat of Embercleave was that it wasn't so all-in. Any creature attacking could potentially put up a great deal of damage with an Embercleave in hand. It made for situations where players had to potentially make bad blocks just in case an Embercleave was in play. This was made all the trickier with the fact that the more creatures that were attacking, the cheaper Embercleave was to cast, and thus the more legitimate it was as a threat. To this day, the card still sees consistent play in red-green aggressive decks, not too dissimilar from the standard decks it originally saw play in. While it sees more play in more general decks and other combat tricks, it doesn't quite reach the level of power ubiquity as the other 2 cards on this list. And at number 2, we have Temur Battle Rage. Originally printed in Faith Reforged, Temur Battle Rage costs 1 generic and 1 red mana. This instant gives a creature double strike, and if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, it also gives that creature trample until the end of the turn. Now, these are the same abilities Embercleave gives, and while Embercleave gives them long term as well as a stat boost, Temur Battle Rage is far easier to cast. So for more traditional aggro decks, a card like Embercleave will be better, but for decks like ones previously mentioned on this list, the cheaper one-off effect is much more appealing. While Embercleave's cost reduction is effective, decks like Death Shadows tend to only really focus on a singular attacker. The card's even a common, meaning that Kiln Fiend's rampant stat boosting can be more threatening with Trample and Double Strike from the Temur Battle Rage. Most every deck mentioned in the process of this list has at also some point played Temur's Battle Rage, save for any standard format deck obviously. It's the most ubiquitous combat trick in the modern era of Magic, providing surprise lethal even through blockers within the first few turns of the game. While not providing any real power directly itself, it essentially doubles the power of whatever creature it targets. And given the nature of these decks, it essentially guaranteed a creature will have 4 or more power, and thus the trample will very rarely not come into play either. Really, the only point against Temur's Battle Rage is that it's primarily an offensive card, but even then, Double Strike can be used defensively in a pinch as well. And finally, at number 1, we have Berserk. With Giant Growth is the textbook example of an old school combat trick. Berserk was the most effective one. Also from the first set alpha, this instant costs a single green mana and can only be cast before the combat damage step. Target creature gains power equal to its current power, doubling it. At the beginning of the next end step, if the creature attacked this turn, it is destroyed. Essentially, Berserk was the precursor to Temur's Battle Rage, finding success as early as the first World Championship in 1994, where it was used alongside creatures like Shivan Dragon for aggressive final pushes. And of course, the deck that takes the most advantage of Berserk is Infect. As early as 2014, Infect got 2nd place at a Grand Prix Edison. At the time, the deck was even called Berserk Poison instead of what it is called now. Berserk provides a type of damage doubling that stacks with abilities like Double Strike, as well as being the cheapest way possible to double a creature's power. Berserk to this day is a mainstay in Legacy Infect, and would be in other formats if it were only legal. Even beyond its surface level power as an offensive tool, Berserk can be used defensively since it only destroys a creature if it attacked. And in certain cases, one can even target an opponent's attacking creature that won't deal too much damage, taking the bigger hit in exchange for destroying the creature. Most cards in this list tend to either have a rather strong offensive effect, a versatile defensive effect, or are extremely cost effective. Berserk exemplifies all three of these and remains one of the strongest combat tricks ever printed, despite also being one of the very first. As such, there's no better choice for the number 1 combat trick in Magic the Gathering. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, go ahead and leave it down as a comment below.